I will teach you how to play the Caro-Kann defense, and in this video we are going to be taking a look specifically at the advanced Caro-Kann. So if you don't know how this opening starts, it starts with e4 by white. We play pawn to c6, preparing the d5 push, and most players with the white pieces are going to play pawn to d4. Afterwards we play pawn to d5, and here there are a couple of different variations, but we are going to study the one where white plays pawn to e5. So there are basically at this point two ways you can approach this. The variation I like is bishop to f5. This is also the most studied, most used variation, most played variation by grandmasters as well in the database. Nowadays the c5 push early on is also a popular approach. I might cover that in a different video. If you are interested, let me know. But here we will continue with bishop to f5. And the main idea with the Caro-Kann is that we want to have a really solid central structure with pawns on e6, d5 and c6, but we don't want our light-squared bishop to be stuck within our own pawn chain. That's the main idea here. The Caro-Kann is in many ways a bit similar to the French defense, but with the difference that we want to get our bishop out, while in the French defense usually you will have something like this with an early c5 instead of c6. So bishop to f5. And of course, as usual, when we are talking about openings, white has so many different options. I will try focusing mainly on all of the most played variations, and in total, we will be taking a look at 6 different lines. So knight to f3, we are going to start off with this for white, most played move, a logical move as well. White just wants to develop and then also castle on the next move. And we are just going to play e6. As I said, we want to create this triangle of pawns and also have our bishop here outside of the pawn chain instead of being stuck. And white has a couple of moves. Here we will continue with the most played move, bishop to e2. Sometimes you also get bishop to d3, the bishop's facing off. We will see that a little bit later. Here we are just going to continue with this setup. And white basically just wants to be flexible and castle as well. So here if we look at this for black, it's always a little bit of a struggle for black to develop the kingside pieces, because your knight can never really go here. You don't want to put it here because it can just be traded and you will have doubled pawns. If you ever put it here, you're blocking in your bishop. g6 is not such a good move. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to develop for black, but there are some plans we can use. And one of the main ideas is to actually wait a little bit with development and play some other moves first. So the move I really like here is the move pawn to c5. And the idea is, as I said, we are playing this French defense-like structure, but with the big advantage that our bishop is already out of the pawn chain. And I especially like pushing this if the light-squared bishop has already moved, because if you push it earlier, oftentimes you will get a check here by the bishop. So for example, let's just say if white plays this, we plays this. There are always variations where the bishop would be able to give you a check. So we are going to play pawn to c5, and we basically want to pressure the really strong white center, and we will do this with our pawn on c5, usually the knight on c6, queen on b6, and we really want to put as much pressure as we possibly can on this pawn. And if black ever caves in, and if white ever caves in, I mean, and they capture here, well, they are just helping us develop, and now it's pretty easy to just develop your knight and castle. So this is what you would like to happen if white just helps you and captures your pawn. Probably not going to happen too much, but yeah, you never know. So here white can do a couple of things, but basically this is under attack, and it's best for white to defend this, because for example, if white just castles, we are going to play this. All of a sudden we already have 2 pieces aiming at this pawn. As I said, capturing is not really a good idea for white. So I would say pawn to c3 is a really common move. Sometimes also castling and then pawn to c3 on the next move. White might also play bishop to e3, because this is a little bit of a trick as well. It's defending the pawn but also putting some more pressure on our pawn. We will take a look at that for our next variation, but we're going to start off with something like pawn to c3, which is pretty simple, straightforward, just protecting all of the central pawns. So we can continue, as I said, knight to c6. We are still not going to worry about this. Somewhat waiting that if white ever captures here, they are just helping us. And if they don't, you will see we also have some other plans for black. Most of the time, your opponent is going to castle. That's their principal idea. They want to get this setup. As I said, you can also have it in the other variation, castling first and then something like pawn to c3. And now, still, if we look at this for black, it's not super clear what we are gonna do. Because, well, we still can't castle, we still have to develop these pieces, it's still not super easy, but yeah, as I said, we are just gonna wait a little bit and delay castling, because honestly, if you have positions like this, there's no real problem with having your king in the center a little bit longer here in these positions, as white just doesn't have a single way to attack, so there's nothing really to worry about. There are many ways you can play the Caro-Kann here, but I always like to play this move pawn to a6, basically because we want to prevent white from ever going here with the bishop, since, as I said, our king is going to be stuck here for a little while. We also don't really want to get any annoying checks. Now we can always play pawn to b5 as well, expanding on the queen side. So that is why this is a rather good move to play. And it's also a little bit of a waiting move, trying to see like what is white going to do. Let's say here white plays bishop to e3, which is a really common tactic. We have talked about this before, trying to force us to do something. And here we can play the move queen b6. And queen b6 is really important in the Caro-Kann because queen b6 develops the queen, also attacks this pawn on b2, especially if this bishop has already left the starting square, while queen to b6 is even stronger because it comes with a double threat of both attacking this pawn and also putting some pressure in the center. And even if the bishop is still here, let's for example just say a random knight move, sometimes this move can be a good move because you can pressure this and then make it harder for this bishop to ever develop. I would probably say, for example, in a position like this. Now, the bishop can't really go anywhere, right, because you would be capturing here on b2 as well. Okay, so we are going to continue with this variation. And white has to do something about this pawn being under attack. There are a couple of things that white can do in these positions. They can usually try to defend with the queen, but of course this would just be losing the queen. So you would have to play something like queen c1, and yeah, I'm not saying it's a bad move, but also it doesn't look so beautiful. Just moving your queen just to protect the pawn. So I think oftentimes you will also see pawn to b3, which we are going to continue with, because especially at the lower rating levels, I think pawn to b3 will be played the most. You could also say queen to b3, after which we can go for this variation, which I will quickly show you. Just trading here, and then we want to eliminate this knight and basically create this structure for white, which we will attack in the future. For example, takes, takes, and you can already see that, yeah, this is not looking so good for white. This is not what you want to have in chess. These pieces all lined up. This can be attacked in the future by the knight. We can now still develop our pieces. Finally, for example, put the knight on f5, and we are going to have a rather pleasant game as well. So let's just say white plays pawn to b3. We can develop the rook. Still, we are not worrying about our kingside pieces. I mean, the bishop has a role here, and the knight is basically just waiting for the bishop to move. So then later on, the knight can go to e7. Knight to b2. Again, multiple ways to play this from the white side, but it's more about trying to remember the ideas than the exact variations as usual. And here we are going to take in the center. And I like to do this, a specific variation where we try to play as many improving moves for our position as possible. So we try to improve our position. We develop the rook, we develop the queen, we even improved the queen side pawns a little bit. And at this point still, white is just saying, I will never capture this, because, okay, I mean, white can capture this, but they are always helping us, as I have already said. None of these variations are really good for white. And if white really doesn't want to capture, and you have basically run out of good moves, I mean, there's not really any good moves here left for black, then it's time to finally capture here in the center. So we are going to capture in the center. And whenever you capture in the center in the Caro-Kann, usually there are 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 different variations white can recapture. You can see the bishop, the knight, the pawn, nope, like this, yeah, the pawn, and sometimes also this queen. So sometimes there are 4 ways for white to recapture. Here there are only 3. But in general, whenever you capture, you also have to keep in mind we are removing the pawn that was defending this. And that's something that white always has to think about. For example, if white just captures here, well, in many variations, you would be capturing on e5. Not here specifically because of this beautiful trick, discovered attack on the queen, but in many lines you can capture here and win a pawn. So here we are going to take a look at every single capture. So let's say we capture with our pawn. As I said, if the knight captures, it's actually best to just go for this, and then play your bishop to c5. And now we were able to finally develop this bishop, but also we did it with a little bit of tempo. We are also putting pressure here, and if white takes us, all of a sudden we have pressure here, and now the knight finally has some zigzagging maneuvering room, so he can develop as well, and then we can castle. So that is fine. If you get a position like that, it's totally fine. If the bishop captures, you should be happy. Usually the bishops are a little bit more valuable than knights. And if you can get something like this is a really good position to have for white. You can even play something like bishop a3, taking away this square. So now you have a really powerful rook, and you can also develop your knight. It's also possible for white to do this, and then I would recommend just drop back your bishop. And now, as I said, we have some room for the bishop. The bishop is going to go to c5, and then we also have some room for the knight, and we can just castle, and we're going to have a pleasant position. Most likely, I think, your opponents will capture with the c-pawn and all of those variations, because this keeps their center really solid, and yeah, there's not really any immediate issues for white. And then here still, we are in this position. We have not really developed the kingside pieces, but we are just going to continue with knight to b4. And as I said, I like just keeping this here for now, because our king, even though our king is still in the center and we are at move 11, I think, it doesn't really matter. The king is rather safe. So yeah, we are just going for the attack, and you can suddenly see why we played all of this. I mean, that was my plan. We are moving the pieces that we can move, and we are just trying to create an attack. And even though white has way more developed pieces than we do, like white is just better developed in a sense, it doesn't really matter. None of their pieces are really taking up any important squares or doing anything important. The bishop is just useless. This bishop is looking at nothing, basically. The knight is just looking at the own pawns, like, doesn't really matter. This knight can never move in. So you can see that the white pieces are not really so well placed. And our goal is just to try and fight against this c2 square if we can. That's a really principled plan for black in the Caro-Kann. We try to fight against this square. If we could potentially put a piece there, a knight or a bishop, that can be quite amazing. And then still we will have time in the future to develop the bishop, develop the knight. Nothing really to worry about. So you can see if I just play any random move for white, that we suddenly have 3 pieces that can potentially go into this square being protected. So oftentimes I think white is trying to avoid this and, for example, play knight to e1. But you can just look at this. The white pieces, even though white has so many pieces away from their starting position, they are not really doing anything. And then here, once we get something like this, now it's time to develop. And okay, you are not going to play bishop e7. That would block all of your pieces. We are going to play the knight out first. I'm just going to make a move for white, for example, attacking our knight. We can always still jump in. We don't have to rush this. We can just do it whenever we want. If white ever captures us, we can always recapture, get some tempo on the queen. And yeah, we can just continue development. Now we even have this f5 square available. If you don't have that square, usually you have the g6 square available. And we just have a really solid position. And in the future, you will be able to also develop your bishop. You will be able to also develop your rook. And you could get a position like this. And now, I mean, we have played 17 moves. Finally, we have castled. But still, black has a pleasant position. We now have a good placed knight. This bishop is putting pressure here, and we can potentially play a5 and some variations and try to create some damage on the white side. And also this bishop is just being annoying, taking away squares. Sometimes we can capture this bishop if we want. Trading rooks, not really a problem. We will always get a new rook to the c file. Now we will look at a slightly different variation. So again, Caro-Kann defense. This is pretty much the same as we have seen before. We go for the early c5. But here we will take a look at what happens if white plays bishop to e3, and we will check this out a little bit more quickly, as well as the future variations, because by now you should already know many of the basic principles for this Caro-Kann advanced position. So if white puts the bishop here early on, You basically have two choices. You can still play queen b6. Queen b6 because we are attacking this, also fortifying the pawn. But I like actually capturing here on d4, and that's why I'm going to show this. If you want to have less variations to study, you can always play queen b6. But the thing is, sometimes you can get something like knight c3, and yeah, capturing here, I mean, it's possible, but it's tricky. It's tricky. You can get a lot of different lines, for example this, and if you try to take this knight for free, all of a sudden your queen is under attack and your queen is trapped. You have to sacrifice it for the rook. Yeah, it can be messy, this position. So that's why I like to keep things simple and just capture in the center here, if we can. That's just a general thing to also keep in mind. It's not because you can capture the b2 pawn that you should. You always have to calculate a little bit. Is my queen gonna get in trouble? Is she gonna be attacked by the rook or by the queen, or what's gonna happen? Sometimes even the knight can jump in here, defended by the bishop, create some counter threats. So always be a little bit careful. So here we are capturing. I think most of your opponents will capture with the knight. They can also capture with the bishop, but I mean, yeah, we are just playing knight c6, immediately attacking them, and they don't have to move the bishop again, but yeah, I mean, usually the bishop is a little bit better than the knight in these positions. So I guess white's gonna capture with the knight. And now the question is, what can we do in this specific variation? Well, whenever this c5 pawn has been released, you can more freely develop all of your pieces. Plus, here you can also see our bishop is now under attack. And usually, if you can save this light squared bishop, you should try to save it. So you can say, I'm gonna move it. But I would say playing knight e7 is also fine, because, well, if white goes for this, they are basically 1, 2, 3, using 3 moves just to give away their knight and to help us get this knight all the way to the f5 square. And yeah, that's just a good position for black. So I wouldn't worry about that if you ever see that. White might castle, and now we can just play normal developing moves, and you will feel that this position without the c3, it's a little bit more free-flowing, like we have a little bit more space to maneuver, because we decided to capture here, and we don't really have any problems as black either. We can get something like this. Okay, maybe the bishop can go to b5, trying to pin, but you can just see that, yeah, we don't really have any problems. Let's say takes. You can actually take with the knight or with the pawn, but of course, remember, if you ever do this, you might get the split pawns, which is not necessarily a big problem, but I personally wouldn't go for this if I can just play like this, and yeah, we still have a really solid structure, and we might play c5 again in the future, kicking away the knight. The rest, however, some opportunity for white to complicate things in these lines, and that's why it's important to look at this. So we are going to take a look at the most aggressive variation by white, and that is playing something like pawn to c4. And the problem with the Caro-Kann sometimes is, as I have said, we are castling very slowly. It's going to take a long time before we castle. So we have to make sure our king stays safe. Even if it's in the center of the board, we have to make sure our king stays safe, and we can do that, but we always have to be a little bit careful. Because if white really starts blowing up the entire position, opening diagonals, going in with checks with the queen, jumping in with the knight, like, you might be in trouble in some variations. So you want to be as safe as you possibly can. And if you play something like knight here, of course you are dropping the pawn. So your knight is kind of stuck, your bishop is kind of stuck, and you realize we don't have any quick way to develop the pieces. We don't have a quick way to get the king out of danger. So that is why this move queen d7 is a really important one to remember here. We are defending this pawn twice, which also releases some tension from the knight. This knight might not move in the future. Now we can move the bishop, now we can castle. So we are playing this to solidify the entire structure and make sure we will be able to castle in the future as well. Let's say knight to c3 by white, which of course is a solid move. Other moves are also possible. For example, you might be thinking, well, what happens if white takes here? But you can see we just take with the knight, and now we do have the freedom to also develop the bishop and to castle. So there's nothing really to worry about here. Yeah, so I think this is a fine position. probably you are going to get something like knight to c3. And if you do, you can always capture on c4 yourself, because this d5 square is a really useful square for us to put our knight. And you might be thinking, way back when white played this, why did we not capture this? Well, actually you can capture this if you want, but yeah, there are also some problems. For example, here all of a sudden two of your pawns are attacked at the same time. Now this is gonna fall. So I like to play this with a little bit of a waiting move, and now we can always capture it later. And if white plays something like queen here, we actually have bishop to d3 as well, and you can suddenly see that everything is pretty well defended. If they try to take here, of course we are grabbing with the knight. Same goes for this. Yeah, so there's nothing really white can do, and white is just behind a full pawn. So that's why I like waiting with capturing here. Let's say knight takes, queen takes, rook takes, knight takes, just to speed up things a little bit. Something like this could happen. And you might be thinking, what is the structure for black? Like, this structure is pretty trash. Yes, well, actually the structure is pretty trash. I'm not going to deny that, but at the same time we are up a pawn. And if we could place our knight here on d5, that would be incredible. And let me just show you one variation. For example, white trying to be aggressive. We just play knight back. White's trying to do something. And we are going to put a knight here. And all of a sudden you can see that, okay, we had a little bit of a trash position, but at the same time we are still up a pawn. And we have a really good knight in the center. We are attacking this bishop. We can potentially do this, put some pressure on this knight as well, and we will be able to castle in the future. And if white thinks he's being smart and capturing our knight, all of a sudden we have the most beautiful structure that you can get in the Caro-Kann. The advanced structure, the pawn from white is gone, and this is just going to be an easy time, an easy win from black. And then next up we are going to look at another important line. This is the third line. And then I will show you 3 different attacking ideas for white as well, but I will put that in a separate video. Here, again, e4, c6, d4, d5, advanced Caro-Kann. You have seen this before, but white plays the very early bishop to d3. Okay, so we get bishop to d3. What are we going to do about this? Well, I have said before that the light squared bishop for black, you have to remember this, it's usually a trash bishop in many of these lines, and you just don't want to have it be stuck within your own pawn chain. And the light squared bishop for white is actually a good piece. White can sometimes use it here on b5 and put some pressure and make things annoying. So my suggestion is just capture this bishop. Just go for something like this, and we should be happy, because our really bad bishop, or French bishop, so to call it, that's usually stuck within the pawn chain, is now not only outside of the pawn chain, but also managed to trade itself for one of the best pieces by white. So that's yeah, a really good trade, if you ask me. And now we can just continue with something like c5, and this is very, very French defense-like, but we are lucky that our bishop has already been developed. Of course, I've said this before, if you get this, you can just be happy, you can develop your knight, castle, and you don't have any problems. So usually white will not capture, but instead play something like c3, or sometimes even bishop to e3. We have already talked about this before. And then the development is pretty natural for black. You just want to play knight here. Again, we are somewhat waiting. If white ever takes this, we are always happy. If white doesn't take this, there are multiple things you can do, but I also think this move h6 is an interesting one, because you are stopping 2 white pieces from potentially coming in here. And as I have said many times before, we do have the time to play some slow moves. We are not really in any immediate danger. And even this diagonal, which is kind of open, doesn't really matter because the bishop is gone. Let's say bishop to e3. You should already know that queen to b6 is the answer here, because we are attacking this weak pawn and also protecting c5. And of course, if white takes, we get this, this, everything is fine. This pawn is weak. We will be able to develop the knight, and everything is just really nice for black. Again, something has to happen. The queen can maybe go back, or b3 can be played. It's all a little bit similar. It doesn't really matter. And now again, can you find any good move here for black? And if the answer is not really, usually you want to capture here. You want to capture so that whatever happens, now we have a little bit more space. We have a little bit more space for our bishop. We can also develop our knight, maybe put the knight on f5. And as I have said before, there are many things that can happen here. The bishop can take, and then I would say go for something like this. If the queen takes, you can be really happy, just capture a free queen. If the knight takes, all of a sudden, bam, we do have this. Okay, sometimes there can be tricks by white, but I mean, we are still getting a queen as well, just to show you something. So something like this can happen. Let's say the bishop goes back, but yeah, white's just losing a piece in all of those lines. So usually you will get something like pawn takes d4, and the position now, as usual, becomes a little bit more free-flowing the moment this c5 pawn is gone. Now we can develop the knight, then we can remaneuver the knight. You can actually go to f5, but here you can always do a little bit of an annoying trick, attacking the queen with the bishop. Then we can develop this knight here. You can also go to c6, but I like keeping the c file open for a rook in the future. If white ever attacks you, don't really worry, you can always go back, and oftentimes you will also try to trade your knight for this bishop if you can. Let's say b4, bishop e7, rook in, castles. And this is something similar to what we have already seen. I mean, we had our really passive knight that's all of a sudden on f5. This knight on c6 is putting pressure. In the center, the bishop is kind of waiting for a future where sometimes after a5 we might be able to create some plans, and the rook's going to slide over here to the c file. White can sometimes try and attack your queen, which is on b6. This can happen in some variations, but you usually don't have to worry. I mean, you can always go back in the worst case. And here we also have some light squares. We can go to b5 or even a6, which attacks the knight. The knight has to go somewhere, but we don't have to worry about this. And if white really takes the time to play knight to a4 and knight to c5, I would say just take it. Because if we count the number of pawns on dark squares, and there are a lot of them here, you will realize that our dark squared bishop is never going to be super useful, because he is always going to be looking at pawns. And he's never going to have a lot of movement. While you can see the knights in the Caro-Kann, the knights can usually jump all around, jump into these light square holes, especially now that the light squared bishop is gone. So if white offers up their knight, I would say grab it with both hands, and yeah, you could just have a good position. And this is just one example here. We are going to try and put our knight into this Caro-Kann hole on c4. There's also a hole here on e4 which you can use, and a pretty pleasant position from white, for example, something like this. Pleasant position for black, of course, I mean. For white it's not so pleasant, I think. White doesn't really have a plan. And I would say here it's also good to keep your knight on c4, because if you ever capture here, you're kind of reversing the roles again and making things more simple. Sometimes you can capture on e3 if that really benefits you. For example, let me just say, if I'm looking for a bad move for white, for example, something like this. I mean, right, you can always try to capture and go for tricks, but usually before that happens, white will already move away the bishop, and then it's not really useful to capture it. So I think this is a really good introduction to the advanced Caro-Kann. There are still some really tricky setups by white you need to know, which I will cover in the next video.